So at the risk of making the relationship that we've been talking about the last 3 days about the complexity between agriculture, nutrition, and health, in this research we add another layer to the already complex relationship, trying to look at how environmental shocks could impact the nutritional outcomes, not just through the yield mechanism, but also through diseases in terms of airborne, waterborne, and other kinds of infections and diseases because of the climatic and weather variability. So this is an ongoing work, and I will be sharing with you preliminary results and some roadmap for what we would like to do next. So I'm sure most of you are familiar about the increased interest and focus by policymakers and the development community about the need to develop resilient food systems and production systems, especially in light of expected climatic changes and potential impact on human welfare and the ecosystem. And within that broad interest, we are having a large number of empirical research looking at the link between these climatic weather shocks and nutritional outcomes. And the presumption in these studies is that most of this effect would work through yield reduction or reduction in the total area cultivated because of climatic changes. But when you look at the papers, most of them don't actually look at how much of the interaction between these environmental changes and nutritional outcomes is actually through the yield effect. Also, there is a lot of heterogeneity, at least from the crop modeling exercise. We know that there is a differential responsiveness of crops to different changes in temperature. There are empirical studies from across Africa and also South Asia, but would like to see if we can look into this possible, ideally causal relationship between these four outcomes or indicators, if you wish, focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa, which is an ideal setting to look at this research question, given the region's reliance on rain-fed agriculture and market and policy failures that limit the set of coping and adaptation strategies available to poor farmers. So I'm sure most of you might have seen this, how diverse the agroecological zones in Africa are. You can see from the south all the way to the north to the arid, semi-arid regions. These are defined mostly based on temperature, the length of growing period that determine the number of humid days per year, and also altitude, whether it's high or low. So what we would like to do is, given this diversity, there is going to be a lot of spatial variability in the incidence of these shocks, climatic weather shocks, and also given that these ecologies are linked to specific farming systems, food systems, we would expect the effects, if any, to differ across these agroecologies. And looking at the data, health, nutrition data from the most recent demographic and health surveys, we also see that there is pockets of areas within the region with relatively high rate of stunting, where you see the pockets in the central region, in the arid, semi-arid regions of the north, some in Ethiopia and East Africa. So the idea behind this research is to, given these anecdotes in terms of the spatial distribution of undernutrition and also distributions of factors that could potentially determine agricultural potential, could we really look into the available data to see and establish ideally causality between weather variability and subsequent outcomes in terms of yield as well as health and nutrition. So to do that, we basically looked at the cross-country data that has been analyzed or harmonized, rather, as part of the ARENA project, Gates-funded project that IFPRI is also leading. So the DHS, they do provide geo coordinates of the clusters as opposed to the household. So we use those clusters to merge nutrition and health data with weather data, specifically precipitation and temperature data from the Climate Research Unit. We also looked at other special explicit variables from a harvest choice database, including Dixon's farming systems, market access, and elevation, and other factors that could potentially mediate the interaction between these changes. So for now, we looked at 3 outcomes: child level minimum dietary diversity indicator, which tells us whether or not the child has consumed at least 4 of the 7 food groups in the 24-hour recall period before the date of interview, and then the standard HAZ and WAZ indicators. We focused on rural kids, mostly because we expect that the shock with the condition, if there is any effect, we would be able to see it better if we focus on rural areas. But we plan to look at urban kids as well. In terms of the shock indicators, we measure both temperature and rainfall, and we counted the number of months within the planting and growing season for which temperature or rainfall was above 2 standard deviations or below 2 standard deviations, the long-term average. So we have, in a way, 4 shocks that we call dry spell, wet spell for positive and negative, and then for temperature, we call heat wave and cold wave. So we ran multivariate analysis, just pulling data across the countries, controlling for the usual suspects at the household, mother, child, and community level control outcomes. We distinguish between cohorts as well as some selected farming systems that support the majority of the population in rural Africa. So here I'll just quickly show you some preliminary results. So this tells you, basically, the dots tell us the coefficient estimates from the multivariate analysis, a linear model, with the 95 confidence intervals that are the bars. So we have some, let's say, significant associations as of now, where a dry spell seems to reduce the dietary diversity for younger kids between 6 and 23 months old. When you look at wet spell, which is precipitation above the long-term average, you see that the association is positive, again focusing on the same kids. Looking at HAZ and lagged shock T-1, we see that heat wave and HAZ are again negatively associated. And focusing on cumulative, so this is basically counting the number of months over 4 planting and growing seasons in the preceding 4 years. And here you see that, again, dry spell seems to have a stronger negative effect on HAZ. I will skip because I'm running out of time. We also find some differential association between farming systems and heat wave, which is also negative. For WAZ, we find the associations that we didn't expect, in the sense that both above average and below average precipitation seems to have a negative effect on this indicator. We're still trying to understand what's driving this one. Previous studies have found negative association because of flooding and subsequent spread of waterborne diseases, but we don't have any evidence to support that as of yet. So in terms of going forward, what we'd like to do is to come up with a better measurement of these shocks, because the way you measure it will automatically or eventually determine what you get, in terms of using more precise measures of temperature in terms of the temporal resolution. And also, when you pull data from 20, 40 countries in Africa, you are just pulling a lot of countries with quite diverse growing seasons, so we would like to improve on that one as well. Yeah, and finally, some methodological improvements that we would like to do. Thank you.